Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Penguin Random House Book and Author Festival, hosted by Library Journal and School Library Journal. My name is Jesse Sanders. I am the branch manager for the Fairview Park branch of Cuyahoga County Public Library, and I'll be moderating the real life narrative session. But first, we'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. This session is being recorded, and it will be available in the virtual environment for 3 months. If you have a question for our speakers, click on the Q&A icon. We'll try to save some time at the end for audience questions. We do not have chat enabled, but near the end of the session, we will be sending you a PDF with details about all of today's authors through the chat window. Live captioning is available. You can either display a subtitle or show the transcript, and you can save the transcript at any time. Note that while the recording will include subtitles, the transcript will not be available on the recording. If you prefer to listen to audio via a phone, click audio settings to access a dial-in number. And please join us on Twitter with the hashtag #PRHBookFest. All right, so we're going to introduce our speakers today. We have 5 titles. The very first one is Facing the Mountain, a true story of Japanese American heroes in World War II by Daniel James Brown, the best-selling author of The Boys in the Boat. Next on our list is The Confidence Men, how 2 prisoners of war engineered the most remarkable escape in history by Margalit Fox, winner of the William Saroyan Prize for Literature and author of 3 previous books, Conan Doyle for the Defense, The Riddle of the Labyrinth, and Talking Hands. Next on our list is Ride of Her Life, the true story of a woman, her horse, and their last chance journey across America by Elizabeth Letts, best-selling author of The $80 Champion and Finding Dorothy. The next title is Every Day the River Changes, 4 Weeks Down the Magdalena by Jordan Salama, a writer who travels from the source of the Rio Magdalena in the Andes to where it meets the Caribbean Sea. And then the final title is Madhouse at the End of the Earth, the Belgica's Journey into the Dark Antarctic Night by Julian Sancton, a senior features editor at Departures magazine who gained the first official access to the expedition's logbook. All right. Hello, everybody. So while I was getting acquainted with everybody's books, one thing I noticed, that there's this sort of theme that went across all of them, which had to deal with like adventure, this sense of adventure. But one stood out specifically because it was from a first-person perspective. So we're going to start with Jordan. Jordan, in Every Day the River Changes, you write about your adventures along the Magdalena River in Colombia. Before departing, you were given several warnings from friends and colleagues, but still you went. So tell us what drew you there.
Yeah, so thank you, first of all, for having me. I really appreciate it. And it's true that Colombia has a certain kind of reputation as a country, I think, in the United States. And when I was planning a trip there, I was told by friends and family and colleagues, oh, I mean, you shouldn't travel there. Will you be kidnapped? Will you encounter narcos or guerrilla soldiers? Because Colombia, for the past 50 plus years, has been in civil conflict, which just recently kind of ended with the 2016 peace deal. But as a kid, my kind of window onto Colombia was actually a piano teacher who I had since I was 5 years old. She was from the Colombian city of Cali. And all I remember was listening to her kind of rambling salsa and arabesque melodies and wanting to learn them. So my window onto Colombia was music for a long time. I come from a Latin American family, also from the Middle East. And so I'm also very interested in kind of the diversity of peoples and ecosystems in Latin America. So I knew that I wanted to work on a project while I was in school that had to do with a river in a country like Colombia. But when I was first given the opportunity to travel there, it was to make an environmental documentary with the Wildlife Conservation Society. And so I called up this piano teacher, Sandra, and she said, oh my God, you should stay with my grandmother in her house. She'll take care of you. This was very different, obviously, from the warnings that I'd heard that you'd mentioned from everybody else. And this grandmother, she was 96 years old. She was bedridden, but she allowed me into her house, and she wouldn't let me leave after 7 p.m. because she wanted to do what she could to keep me safe. But I did. I was able to go on these adventures with people all over the country. I went whale watching on the Pacific coast. I saw, bore firsthand witness to Asian and African migrants who were going on these near-death marches through inhospitable jungles to try to reach the United States. And I realized that this was a very complex country, much more nuanced than the kind of maligned reputation, single reputation that it seemed to have here. And one person said, oh, if you want to understand Colombia, you should understand the Rio Magdalena, the Mississippi River of Colombia, the most important river in the country. And that's when I knew I had to go and travel there. And so that's what I did, traveling the length of the river and meeting the people who live along the way.
Awesome, thank you. So the next question is for Margalit. Ms. Fox, The Confidence Men centers on two British officers who were in prison in a Turkish POW camp during World War I. So briefly describe for us their plan for escape. Oh, you're muted.
I can describe it so briefly, it occupies fewer than 10 words. The officers escaped by means of a Ouija board. And that's the story. This is a true story. Two officers, Harry Jones and Cedric Hill, were captured in the Ottoman Theater in 1916 and sent to one of the remotest POW camps of the war. It was deep in the mountains of Anatolia, 4,000 feet above sea level, surrounded by jagged mountains and impassable desert, and was therefore considered escape-proof. It was the Alcatraz of World War I, if you will. These two officers conceived a confidence game played against their captors brilliantly, impeccably planned, and with the highest stakes in the world, freedom, and the highest stakes in the other direction. If their ruse were discovered, they would be shot. And knowing this, they nonetheless persevered. They developed, with the aid of a handmade Ouija board that looks like no Ouija board you've ever seen, a con game worked on their captors little by little that persuaded them that these two officers could not only commune with the spirits, but they could have those spirits tell them the whereabouts of buried treasure, buried elsewhere in Turkey, wouldn't you know it, pretty far from the camp, that would be the captors, if only those captors would lead the prisoners far from camp in search of it. And that's what happened.
Whoops, sorry. Thank you. So the next question is for Mr. Brown, Daniel Brown. So your title, Facing the Mountain, as I'm sure you're aware that there's this national conversation right now about violence against the Asian American community in this country. So that makes this book really timely. So my first question for you is, was this conversation, or did this conversation at all inform the writing of this book?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, I started working on this book just about the time the Trump administration came into power. And so there were all these issues, not just of violence against Asians, but xenophobia and white nationalism and anti-immigration sentiment. And that coincided, actually, I happened with the beginning of the administration to be writing about the immigrant parents of my characters. And so, of course, that really motivated me to dig into those stories and to tell them richly and faithfully and in a way that would move people. So yes, more generally through the whole writing of the book, xenophobia and those kinds of related issues were very much on my mind. In terms of anti-Asian sentiment and rhetoric and violence, I learned so much in the course of researching this book. I thought I knew quite a bit about it, but I learned really about how deep the roots of anti-Asian racism, sentiment, violence, how deep those roots reach in American history. I mean, they go back to the 1849 gold rush in California, when many Chinese immigrants came to California and to the West Coast to build railroads. And there was an extraordinary level of violence directed against them. People were beaten, people were driven out of town, people's homes were burned down, people were even lynched in the gold fields. And that went on through the whole second half of the 19th century and into the 20th century. And this was also a time, of course, when this notion of the yellow peril was rising, not just in the United States, but around the world, actually. But particularly on the West Coast of the United States, it was very prominent in the newspapers. So these tropes and these images and these vicious images, stereotypes arose of Asian Americans or Asian immigrants as rats or insects or vermin of whatever kind, that they were infesting the country. And what's interesting to me is my book really begins with Pearl Harbor, although I go back in time to talk about the immigrant parents of my characters. When Pearl Harbor happened, all those tropes and images were already in the American psyche. And so they immediately rose to the surface again in the wake of the attack on Pearl Harbor. They were ready-made. And then I think what's most interesting to me is just in the last year or so, I've come to realize that they're still there. Those same tropes, those same images, those same stereotypes are just sort of stored in the American psyche, ready to be pulled out by those who would exploit them for political gain. So when the pandemic came up, that fit right into this notion of disease and vermin and something infesting the country. So it was pre-existing, and what we're seeing now is just really the reemergence of something that has been there for a very long time.
So just one quick follow-up. What do you hope this book, or rather, what do you hope this book will contribute to this discussion?
Yeah, well, you know, I hope part of what I try to do in this book is make my readers very familiar with these four central characters whose lives I trace. So you really get to know them on a very personal level. And I think one of the best ways to break down any kind of racial stereotyping is if people just get to know you on a personal level. So my biggest hope is that readers come away from this story, I'm talking about non-Asian readers in particular, come away from this book with a lot more empathy for what, in this case, Japanese immigrants and their American-born children went through and what they contributed to this country, beginning in the 19th century and then all through the 20th century. I hope that personalization will help break down some barriers.
Thank you. Next question is for Mr. Sancton, Julian. So your story, Madhouse at the End of the Earth, is about Antarctic exploration. So stories about polar explorations, or failed polar explorations, could almost be their own genre. Yeah. So what distinguishes Madhouse at the End of the Earth from other similar stories that may have been written in the past?
Well, perhaps most importantly, because I would argue that it wasn't a failure, at least not in the end. There was definitely failures of leadership that led to tremendous suffering and the loss of life, but there were also heroic triumphs. So let me backtrack a little bit. My book is about the Belgica expedition, which was the first of the so-called heroic age of polar exploration. So it's before Shackleton, before Mawson, before Scott, and it left, of all places, from Belgium. It was the first scientific expedition to Antarctica in 1897. And it became an epic struggle for survival after the captain couldn't resist the urge to steer relentlessly south as the winter ice was closing in. So it ended up becoming one of the great battles between man and nature. And I don't want to give too much away, but all I'll say is I wouldn't have had much to write about if no diaries had returned. So in the end, man was victorious, even if in some cases it was a Pyrrhic victory. It was also the first purely scientific expedition to Antarctica. So the goal was to understand at least as much as possible the last great geographical mystery on Earth, to study Antarctica's geology, its meteorology, its fauna, and its flora, what little flora there was. And it wasn't meant as a bid for glory or an attempt at heroic, death-defying exploits that would electrify the public. But of course, that's what ended up happening after the ship was caught in the ice for more than a year. The men had no idea what to expect from an Antarctic winter, and because they were not planning on finding out, they were utterly unprepared. It ended up, they ended up suffering from not only scurvy, which I think is part and parcel with Antarctic missions of this kind, but also a kind of despair that came from cold and darkness, yes, but also isolation and confinement, something that I think we can all relate to these days. And the way they dealt with these problems was very instructive to people, the future explorers from Shackleton to Scott to Mawson, and even to the explorers of today are continuing to learn from it. I think NASA is still drawing lessons, even as we planned manned missions to Mars from the Belgica expedition. And in many ways, Mars is as daunting an alien environment today as Antarctica was in the 19th century. And finally, I think another big difference between this expedition and the ones you may have heard of is that it's one of the few noteworthy Antarctic expeditions from the heroic age that weren't Anglo-American, which may explain why the English-speaking world knows less about it.
Thank you. So on to Ms. Letts. So while I was reading your book, Annie just struck me as the ultimate singular person, you know, and so much so that I just kept forgetting that I was reading nonfiction. So tell us a little bit about Annie. Like, when did you first hear of her, and why did you decide to write her story?
You know, it's funny that there are a million books about great deeds that are done by heroic people in extraordinary circumstances. Very often they're men. But sometimes I think the greatest amount of courage for a great escape is to escape from the set of expectations that are handed to you, and the courage to kind of step out of the rut of your own life. And that was what drew me to Annie Wilkins. She was a 62-year-old woman. She was a farmer in rural Maine. And by the time she was 62, she had really fallen on hard times. She had a 6th grade education. She had been ill with tuberculosis that she'd picked up working in a factory, which she used to go work on the factory and the farm at the same time because the main farm really couldn't support a person. And she was supposed to rest, but she had no idea how to rest. She had no money, and she'd worked every single day of her life. But the thing about Annie, she had nothing to show for that. She had no money, she had no savings. Basically, what little money she had been wiped out from a stay in the hospital. And she was alone. She was not married. She had no children. And her only companion was a little dog that she loved very dearly. She didn't know what to do. And I think in her situation, a woman like Annie I mean, she was the ultimate woman who would be overlooked and ignored. She wasn't especially pretty. She wasn't very young. She just didn't have anything. And people thought that they knew what she was going to do next. She was offered charity to stay in the old folks' home. To accept charity for a person of her generation from Maine was really culturally unacceptable. But she also kind of just had this belief in herself. She wanted to do something. She wanted to see the Pacific Ocean just once before she died. Now, when you have no money and you have no car, she didn't even have a map. I mean, honestly, she really didn't know very much about the world beyond this kind of small area, rural Maine, where she lived. But she just thought she could do it. And she got herself an ex-racehorse and kind of gathered up every single thing she could, packed onto her horse, tie it up, took her dog in November in Maine, started riding south, hoping she could get to the Pacific Ocean. What drew me to Annie's story was just, I think that everybody has had that feeling of like, you know, everybody already knows what they expect of you. Everybody thinks your ideas are crazy, and what makes you think you can do that? And that was why I loved Annie Wilkins, because she had the courage to just give it a try.
Excellent. So let's go back to Jordan. So you spoke a little bit about what drew you there. So let's talk more about like while you're there, because I'm sure, I mean, I know I was, I don't know like, what other readers will feel, but like I was fearful, like reading this book, a lot of the times, sure, there's these great, meetings that you have with people along the way. But the fear was like number one present in the back of my mind most of the time while reading your book. So, understanding that overcoming fear is like a necessary part of the journey. How did you mitigate the fear that you must have had, while you were in like some of the most remote parts of Colombia?
Sure. It's a very valid point. And I was young. I was just 21 years old when I traveled the Magdalena too. So fear would have marked, I think, any journey that I took in another country by myself at that age, let alone one maybe as unfamiliar and with the kind of difficult and perhaps misguided reputation that Colombia, again, has here in the United States. What I like to say I did was to create a line of trust as I moved along the river. So that line began with my piano teacher and her grandmother on that very first trip a few years earlier, as I mentioned, but it moved with me as I traveled. So everywhere I went, people would mention places and friends that they knew further downriver. And I'd end up meeting those people too. So sometimes I'd even stay in their homes. I met biologists studying the only wild and invasive hippopotamuses who live outside of Africa. They're in the Magdalena River in Colombia, and it's this huge problem. I met a school teacher who runs a traveling donkey library for his rural students who don't have access to books, an elderly jeweler who day after day works on dazzling silver creations, like in the novels of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, even though he doesn't have customers anymore to buy them. And that taught me about the importance of passion and persistence in the midst of chaos. So each of these people who I met, they taught me something different. And that helped, I think, to lessen the fear along the way of the journey. But, a real fear that I think many people will have. But every person who I met ended up indelibly influencing where I'd go next, kind of how it works in life also. But that's how I did it. And so the result was this kind of very exciting adventure featuring a lot of local voices. At the end of the day, what I hope this book will do once it's out in the world and people have it in their hands is to extend that line of trust that I created for myself along the river to each and every reader, maybe even people who might be planning a trip to Colombia for themselves, to foster this more kind of nuanced and empathetic understanding of a misunderstood and complex country. That's what I hope travel writing in general is moving towards. It's a genre that's kind of had problems in the past, maybe, or been questioned as, should we still be doing this, going to faraway places and writing about people? But I think that the way my generation at least wants to see travel writing work is as a vehicle for empathy, kind of like what Daniel was saying. This is my first book. I'm just getting started, but I hope to be a voice leading that kind of empathetic travel writing for my generation.
Excellent. Thank you. So for Ms. Fox, while reading The Confidence Man, I found myself like literally laughing out loud at times, over some of the antics that these guys pulled. But then like immediately I was like, oh, maybe I shouldn't laugh at this because these guys are like in serious danger, like most of the time, So how do you, or rather, how did you balance the humor and then like these really heavy, kind of themes in your book?
Nothing you could have said could have made me happier than the fact that you laughed out loud in this book about indeed what promises to be a very dark situation. Two guys locked into a remote POW camp in 1916 to 1918. And needless to say, going into the story, I had no idea that there would be these moments of high comedy. We all know that we as nonfiction writers have to have complete fealty to the history that we uncover, whatever it was. And you can imagine my delight when in the middle of this dark story, I saw moments of farce that rival anything Joseph Heller could have imagined in Catch-22. And it was all real. It was all documented historical fact. And when you stop and think about it, maybe it's not so surprising that there were these moments of high comedy when you have a preposterous setup. You have two canny prisoners of war who, with nothing but time on their hands, build a Ouija board from salvage, and create a hoax that involved an imaginary treasure hunt with clues, and they made up actual physical clues and planted them, near the camp, clues that were supposedly planted by ghosts. And they got their iron-fisted captors to believe all this stuff and respond to it and literally go out on treasure hunts looking for clues that had been planted in a tin can buried in the earth, supposedly by a ghost. So how could that not be farcical? And of course, as any dramatist knows, when you have a horrible scene with characters killed and blood spilled everywhere and tears shed, you had better have something funny in the next scene or you're going to lose the audience forever. So it was the best thing that could have happened to me as a nonfiction writer.
Thank you. Let's see here. Let's go back to Mr. Sancton. And so this is more of a process question. How did you go about doing the research for Madhouse at the End of the Earth?
Well, once I'd heard about this story, just read a couple paragraphs about this, these men who were stuck in the ice and who dealt with what they dealt with and were ultimately, not all of them obviously, but many of them were saved by the ingenious innovations of a man who was much maligned by history, the American surgeon Frederick Cook. I felt this was just a story. I couldn't believe that it hadn't been told, and so I needed to tell it in the novelistic way that I wanted to, that I felt it deserved. And the only way that I know how to do that, because I'm not a novelist, is to go right, as all of you do, go down to the primary sources and get a visceral feel for these characters. And the highlight of that for me was not just reading their writings, which were very instructive and helped me tell the story, but really connecting with certain objects that they interacted with. So the first object that I saw that had been on the Belgica was when I visited the great-grandson and the great-grandchildren of the Belgica's commander, a man named Adrien de Gerlache. And right there, when they welcomed me in their palace, he was a baron, so in their palace outside Ghent, Belgium, under the stairway was the sledge that had been built for this expedition by Frederick Cook. So the first thing I do is I ask, can I touch it? They said, well, of course. And it was just, for them, it was nothing. It was just a family heirloom. Then they pull out a big metal trunk, just beaten up, kicked around. They open it up and it was another treasure trove. There were photographic glass plates. There were sounding leads. And they had to rummage through everything to find these 2 giant volumes that were the captain's log for the Belgica. I mean, for me, this was the Gutenberg Bible, and we sat there. They had never actually read through the whole thing, so just together we read through the story of their ancestors' expedition, and it read like an adventure book. Even though the language was the way captain's logs can be, they're very clipped and terse. There was poetry in it. And I could feel them becoming very emotional. The next day, I went to the Institute of Natural Sciences in Belgium, in Brussels, and it was a scientific expedition. And so they brought back all of the biological and geological and botanical specimens that they brought back are now in that museum, in these back rooms that were filled with taxidermy. It felt like a magical realist menagerie. And it's like at the end of the Raiders of the Lost Ark, when they put the Ark away in a crate and it's lost to history. It was they're just going through the scientist who led me around took me. He pulled out a big wooden crate, pulled out a giant emperor penguin. That was a taxidermied penguin. And this was the closest I came to meeting a member of the expedition. This was a creature that they had interacted with. Unfortunately, the interaction didn't go very well for the penguin. And I told myself, as gruesome as it is to look at this dead-eyed bird, the fact is this bird, the meat of this bird, saved them from scurvy. This was one of the great innovations of Frederick Cook. He realized that the canned food just wasn't cutting it. The bottled lime juice wasn't cutting it. They needed to survive on the land, and they did it by eating penguin. A little footnote to this, and another highlight of my research: I wanted very much to know what penguin tasted like, which would, I think, give me that visceral sense. Unfortunately, that's been outlawed since 1991. I did travel to Antarctica, but didn't manage to sneak away and club a penguin. And so, but what I did taste is, I don't know how I was conned into this, but the Belgian scientist with a very wry sense of humor, showed me an abyssal fish that he told me was in a jar of ethanol, that he told me had been taken on the Belgica expedition. I have no idea whether this is true or not. I was trusting him, but it looked like it had been in that jar for about 100 years, and I think it was. And he told me, taste a drop of the liquid. And I said, why would I do that? He goes, he promised me that people do this all the time. And so I tasted it, and it tasted like camphor, and I'll never do it again. And I'm pretty sure I've been had.
Wow. That's awesome. Thank you. Thank you. So on to Mr. Brown. So my first question to you sort of focused on like conflicts, from two Asian Americans, like from outside of the group, right? So let's kind of transition to internal group conflicts. In part 3 of your book, you wrote about some conflicts that were happening between the newly recruited Japanese American soldiers who were born and raised in Hawaii versus the ones who were born and raised on the mainland. So in your opinion, what do you think were some of the sources of that tension? And, did they eventually resolve them?
Yeah, so 3 of the 4 characters I follow, the young men whose stories I follow, joined the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. And they were all sent to Camp Shelby in Mississippi for basic training. Some of them came from Hawaii, some of them came from the mainland. Most of the guys from the mainland had come out of the concentration camps where they had been held with their families. When they arrived at Camp Shelby, it was like trying to mix oil and water. The guys from Hawaii and the mainlanders just could not get along at all. Within the first week of basic training, fistfights were breaking out all over camp, and their senior officers just didn't know what to do with these guys. There were a number of problems. Probably the biggest single problem was language. The kids that had grown up in Hawaii, many of them had grown up on sugarcane and pineapple plantations. All the guys from Hawaii spoke Hawaiian pidgin. The guys from the mainland could not understand what they were saying, just didn't understand this language at all, and thought that they sounded kind of ignorant. So they tended to snicker at them and laugh at them. Which wounded, understandably, the feelings of the guys from Hawaii. So there was this huge problem with communicating and with assumptions each group was making about the other group. They were different in many other ways. The guys from Hawaii tended to be very carefree, happy-go-lucky, liked to party, liked to drink. The guys from the mainland were much more serious, and the Hawaiian guys did not understand that, why the mainlanders didn't ever want to party or get some beer or whatever. Part of the reason for that was that most of the mainland kids, as I said, were coming out of these camps. And they were joining the army because they wanted to prove something. They wanted to prove that they were loyal Americans. And they were mad about the situation where their families were living in these camps. The Hawaii guys hardly knew the camps existed, didn't understand that at all. So there was a huge misunderstanding about that. Finally, one of the chaplains got the idea to put the Hawaii guys on buses and take them to their 2 camps nearby in Arkansas. They put the Hawaii guys on buses, took them to the camps, showed them these people living behind barbed wire, the parents of many of the mainlanders that they were serving with. And that was the beginning of a sort of reconciliation where the Hawaii guys began to understand why the mainlanders were so upset, why they were so serious. And it took a long while for this to work itself out. But over time, they did, the wounds healed. The mainland guys all learned to speak Pidgin. And by the time they were on the battlefields in Europe, they were like brothers. They were very, very close.
Excellent, thank you. Question for Ms. Letts. So in the ride of her life, when Annie sets off, she hardly even has the essentials that you had mentioned before. So with barely any money and any real plan, she sets off and relying on her wit and the kindness of strangers. And it worked, right? So now, having written the book and understanding Annie's world a little bit more clearly, do you think that's something that could happen now? Or was the era that she lived in kind of special in some way?
You know, I think if what you took away from this book was that the 1950s was a kinder and gentler time, that would really be the wrong message. I think that's not true. I mean, first of all, I think it's important to point out that as a white woman, Annie had freedom of movement available to her that Black Americans did not have. And if you were a Black traveler at that time, you would face overt discrimination from whites only establishments and the threat of violence, very real threat of vigilante violence and arbitrary arrest. So I would never make the case that the 1950s, you know, was a better time for Americans to make this kind of journey. That being said, I'm very fascinated by times of technological change where we have a rapid change in technology that is going to affect human society and human behavior. And this time period, the mid-1950s, really is a good example of that, because this is really the moment of the American car. We had millions of automobiles coming off of assembly lines at this time. This is the first time that most Americans had a car in their garage. And 1 in 6 Americans in the 1950s was employed in the automobile industry. We also had a rapid increase in traffic, and we had roads that were not suited for these many cars. And also we didn't have safety. So traffic accidents and traffic fatalities was a constant subject of discussion. High traffic fatalities, they kept going up year over year over year over year. We would have more people killed. So this is the world that Annie, on her horse, mostly in ignorance, rode out into. She rode out into a world that was just on the verge of being radically transformed by the interstate highway system and cars. And you see her riding, you know, she navigated eventually, she didn't have a map of the entire United States, which made her take this very circuitous route. But she navigated mostly with those old-fashioned gas station maps. And she would have, you know, remember they would just show kind of one segment of the road. And when you look at them, they're so fascinating. They're like a document to reveal what America looked like at that time. It was a network of small towns that were mostly connected by 2-lane highways. And when we think of the 1950s, we think of, you know, Mayberry RFD and Andy Griffith and the small town. But in reality, when something begins to be an object of nostalgia on television, or for example, Disney's Main Street USA was built in 1956, that's a sure sign that people are already worried that that thing is disappearing. So Annie rode through a country that was a small town country, and it had a high degree of social trust. And you see that in her interactions with people. But you also see that car barreling down the American highway, as it were, coming, that was leading to a more suburban, more atomized country with a lower degree of social trust. And here you can really see it happening. And I felt like one of the things that really epitomizes that to me is the old business bypass. So some of my fellow panelists mentioned that they've been road tripping during the pandemic, and you're out there on that interstate and you see the name of a town and you kind of think that'd be cool to drive through it. But you know what? You don't. You don't take the business bypass. You keep going by on the interstate. You stop at the big anonymous gas station, maybe at a fast food place. And to me, that was what was fascinating about Annie's journey, that this is a window, a little snapshot of what it looked like just before we went fully onto an interstate world. That being said, you know, I believe in the goodness of Americans. I do. And honestly, I think that if another Annie took to the road, I think she would find a lot of people willing to lend her a helping hand today.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. So we've got about 9 minutes left. So we're going to go through some quick questions. We have a couple from participants as well. So let's see here. So starting with Jordan, are you planning on returning to Columbia anytime soon?
I have actually returned to Columbia since I researched my book, but you know, pandemic permitting, I would love to go back. I think that what's fascinated me the most about the country is just its tremendous diversity, again, in people and places to see. So there's an endless amount of stories. My hope is that I'll be there as soon as I can.
Awesome. For Mr. Brown, so tell us about your ideal reader. Like, who did you write Facing the Mountain for?
You know, my ideal reader for any book I write is anybody with who's naturally curious about history, about other cultures, about places they may not have ever been, experiences they might not have had. I think curiosity is the thing I hope most for in readers. Also, though, I think I always hope that people are able to make connections between their own lives and what they're reading in my book. So, I mean, I was really pleased with The Boys in the Boat, as I was hearing back from readers, the kinds of connections people found between their own lives and the stories of those 9 young men in the boat. And same thing with this new book. I'm hoping people look to see how this relates to their own lives, to the lives of their neighbors. And particularly, I'm hoping they look for the connections, as we talked about a little bit, between this story and what's happening in the country today.
Thank you. So I have a participant question for Julian. So this question, I'll just read it. I've read the book Icebound, published last year. It talked about the Barents' trip to the Arctic. There were documents published after their trip. Do you know if your book subjects were aware of this trip or these documents' existence because they would have prepared them for what to expect?
Sure. I mean, the Barents expedition took place also it was on the other end of the world. It was in the Arctic, and it was several centuries before they had set out. It was well known. I mean, the Barents Sea is named after William Barents, and not only that, but he left from Holland, which was before 1830, was the same, you know, the same country as Belgium. And or at least, you know, give or take a few wars. So there was definitely a sense that there was not only from Barents, but from many other Arctic and Antarctic expeditions, that these were the most hostile environments on Earth. So even though, unlike Barents, they knew that they weren't going to be facing any polar bears, they knew that they were going to be facing some tremendous challenges, from the cold to the pressure of sea ice, and to whatever beasts may lie beyond the Antarctic Circle. It was really, aside from a few sketchy coastlines, the Antarctic was a void at the bottom of the world. Much the same way that the Arctic was in the 1600s for William Barents. So they did draw a little bit from the experiences of previous intrepid Arctic explorers, but I would argue that they drew even more from the works of people like, you know, Coleridge and Edgar Allan Poe and Jules Verne, who imagined whatever, who imagined some almost, you know, science fiction like scenarios, because that's the only thing the only way we could fill that void at the bottom of the earth was through literature. So they they didn't really have a great sense of what they were getting, what they were in for.
Thank you. Let's see here. Questions. Let's go to Ms. Letts. There's a couple of questions here. I'm going to kind of condense them into one. So they both deal with like the difference between writing fictional novels and then writing real life narratives. So it's like, first question, like, what's the difference? And then which one do you enjoy writing better?
Yeah, I'm the weirdo who writes fiction and nonfiction. And I will tell all of my fellow nonfiction panelists here, I much prefer fiction. It is much easier. Nonfiction is really hard because you have to tell a compelling story that people want to read, a big old page turner, which it sounds like all of my fellow panelists have found a story like that. But I liken it to tearing up little bits of newspaper, throwing them in the air, and then trying to assemble a story out of that. You know, with fiction, going gets tough. You just blow up a car. But in nonfiction, you have to build a compelling story out of real facts. But they serve different purposes, you know, and there are certainly times when all of we nonfiction writers feel like we wish we could just push that door open because the documentary evidence stops and there just is no way to really know what that person was thinking or feeling in the moment. And we have tricks, you know, we build the story in such a way that perhaps at that exact moment the reader is hopefully not going to notice. But yeah, I find fiction illuminating of emotional truths, but I think nonfiction is just, there's something satisfying about a true story.
Excellent, thank you. And let's see, Ms. Fox, if the Confidence Men were chosen for a book discussion, right? Because we're all librarians here, you know, on this other side. What topics would you like to be discussed? Like, what would you like us to focus on when we bring this book up?
Well, there are two things, and these are the things that struck me the most deeply when I was working on the story. One, as any librarian knows, there's a whole genre of POW escape books, nonfiction books, and films. But if you think about what they are, The Great Escape, The Wooden Horse, Stalag 17, all World War II. The story of the Confidence Men was kind of doubly marginalized in terms of present day history looking back, in that it's World War I, and that within that war, we all know the Western Front. This is the Ottoman theater with places that resonate in the news today. This story plays out over modern day Syria, Iraq, the Sinai Peninsula. So that's fascinating. It's often called the forgotten theater of World War I, and I think that's right. That's the first thing. The second thing is my overriding concern in bringing this 100-year-old story to a modern audience was to imply the immense relevance to our own time, because the questions I was trying to answer, how does a master manipulator create faith and then sustain it? Create faith in things that aren't true. And why do his converts persist in the face of thundering counter evidence? Dare I mention the anti-vaxxers? Why do they persist in believing things that are patently false? And that has so much relevance to sadly, to the America of our own day. And I hope that's what people will take away.
Awesome, thank you, thank you. Thanks so much for all of our wonderful speakers. It is almost 12:50, so we're gonna wrap it up. Thanks to everyone attending today. This session will be archived and available soon in the live sessions area. So please remember to save a transcript now if you wish. We're gonna take a short break. And if you haven't done so yet, please make sure to visit the exhibit hall and the sponsors booth and giveaways, downloads, and resources. And don't miss our next session at 1:30 Eastern with Andy Weir and a keynote conversation. Thanks everybody for showing up, and have a good day.
Thank you.